Hello and welcome to Tech Takeaways, the podcast taking technology's largest challenges and breaking them down into little bite-sized chunks for you. I'm your host, Jason Fitzgerald, and I'm joined as ever by my dynamic co-host, Paul Stringfellow.
I am here full of dynamism, so thanks.
Welcome. So this episode is on data loss prevention. What is data loss prevention? And what you can do within your organization to protect yourself against losing your data. So, Paul, why is this a thing? Why do we need to talk about this?
So I think we probably should have renamed this Wayne loss prevention, because as people will notice, we've still without Wayne, but he's a busy lad. We'll get him back next time. I mean, this is a conversation I have with organisations all the time. It's a really it's high on the list of priorities for CIOs, CTOs. It should be on the kind of a board level discussion in terms of data is a really important asset to a business, and making sure that asset is looked after and protected in the way that any other important asset is in a business. It should be absolutely crucial. And there's huge risks associated with losing data. It might be a regulatory risk, so you're losing information that contains sensitive information about individuals. So we've all had the discussions around GDPR or the UK Data Protection Act, but you're also seeing those kind of regulations replicated across the world. Some more stringent than GDPR, some less stringent than GDPR. So from that point of view, regulatory instance, then we've got to take care of our data. But there's also other elements that we need to take care of. It might be intellectual property, might be sensitive customer information. So then there's a commercial element to losing data, where we might be losing that data to, the classic example is always one of your sales team going to a competitor, takes a whole bunch of sensitive commercial information with them and gives your competitor an advantage. So lots and lots of good reasons that if you're a business owner or somebody charged with looking after security inside your organization, that data protection and data loss prevention should be high on the list.
Do you think that it gets the focus it deserves? You say it should be high on the list. Is it high on the list?
I think that's a good question, actually. And sometimes I think it's very dependent on the type of organisation. So in some heavily regulated industries, data loss prevention is right at the top of kind of list of priorities, because it has to be. But I think in some organisations, it perhaps doesn't get the... one of the things I like to talk to people about is to think about this idea of data-centric security. A lot of our security traditionally has been around the perimeter. We've all talked about how much the world has changed over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of the way we work, the way infrastructure is built. It's no longer all in the data center. We're not all always working in the office on our enterprise laptop. Not all of those things. Not all of those things remain true. Yeah. And because of that, the way that we use data has changed hugely. So we need to make sure that our security policies are built around data and information way more than around infrastructure and technology.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, because when we look at traditional IT, where we've got this walled garden, on-prem estate, for example, or everything is within the network that we control, so relatively few or zero cloud services in there, we can be quite restrictive about what's in there. But even though we can almost control it end to end, there's still an infinite number of ways that your data can go missing. I mean, I remember working probably 12 years ago to deploy a data loss prevention system. It was based on a firewall. There was a firewall within the network on the gateway, and it could recognize the data that was flowing through it. And we could categorize data in such a way that says, if it looks like a credit card number, don't allow it to go out. Or we could do the same on email. But the technology and the methods changed. For example, and not to get too technical on this, but DNS, the way that website domain names are looked up, is open on almost every network. So if you go to a coffee shop and it's got a paid for network, so you need to pay for the network before you can get internet access, DNS is almost always allowed. And because you've got that channel out, there's a communications channel out, and you can still leak data out that way. So even though we've got tried and trusted mechanisms to protect against data coming out, cyber criminals are always going to find a way, and cloud just enables that more.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that have changed kind of the data loss landscape, if you like, and one of them is that move to cloud, but also that move to the way that we work differently now. So we need. It's it's interesting the example you give, because it's okay to take an approach that says contain sensitive information, therefore bad, do not share, do not allow out.
Yeah.
But of course, the way that we work today, the way that we work internally as organizations, but the way we work with partners, with customers, with providers, that there's still there's an increasing requirement to collaborate and share information. So I think it's very hard to build a strategy around sensitive information must always be locked inside of our organization. So it's not so much about, while we've termed this data loss prevention, it's not so much about the idea of stopping the sharing of sensitive information, however we define sensitive. It's not so much about that, but it's about enabling the secure use of that.
Yeah.
And often when I talk to businesses, I will ask them to look at where they think the risks might lie. And there's kind of three general areas of risk for data loss. There is the idea that it can be malicious. And then there's kind of two variants of malicious. There is malicious external threat. We've talked on previous episodes about the threat that comes from phishing. You just talked about data being lost kind of maliciously through DNS and DNS hijacking type approaches.
Yeah.
So there's that. There's a malicious external threat. But there's also the malicious internal threat we kind of touched on before. The idea that somebody's moving to a competitor, or somebody doesn't like something your organization's doing, so feels they want to leak sensitive information out to third parties. So there's always that. And of course, there's pure accident. Somebody oversharing something. I'm sure, I was going to say, I'm sure we've all done it, but I'll admit to having done this, but attaching some information to an email, and then because of Outlook auto-filling the name in, I've sent that information to the wrong person. And that has been what would be deemed sensitive information in the past. So, it's very easy for these things to go. And the risk, as you say, cloud has just driven that risk, because there's more and more places we can put information, whether it's shared in Teams, whether it's in SharePoint Online, whether it's OneDrive, Box, Dropbox, Slack, Zoom. There's a whole bunch of places that we can put information. So you're absolutely right. That change in infrastructure and workflow has changed the amount of places we can lose data from. But it also means, I think, that to address the problem, we need to think differently. The idea that we just build DLP into a firewall now is probably no longer appropriate as a comprehensive way of stopping data being lost from an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've spoken previously about technologies such as Azure rights management, being able to stamp the file with security so that the security travels with the file regardless of where it is. So that's one mechanism by which you could securely share the file. But it's two sides of the same coin, isn't it? Securely sharing and DLP, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it? So what else can companies do to kind of help themselves?
So I think there's it's interesting actually. Kind of the week we're recording this, we've had a couple of interesting chats with customers over the last couple of days, where they are starting on this journey, this kind of data. How do we build more data-centric security? Is certainly the phrase I like to use. And I think there's a number of steps that organisations should probably look at to take. And I think the very first one, and actually the most important one, and in a previous episode where we had our guest Rory talking with us about security, one of the things he talked about was the idea of making sure we have buy-in. And I think when it comes to building any kind of data-centric security platform, buy-in is essential. Organizations need to understand why they're going to go down a process that will change potentially the way that people work. It will restrict the way potentially that people can use and share data in ways that right now is unrestricted, in the future might become restricted. So people have to fully understand why they're doing that. They have to understand what the risk of losing data is to an organization. They need to understand the impact of building a policy around it, and they also need to understand where the risks lie in terms of that. So, but doing that initial, in fact, if there was one thing that an organization could do, if they were to build a DLP policy, and we talk about another couple of things in a moment, but there's one thing that they should do is get buy-in, from top to bottom of an organization, from chief exec to new hire. They need to understand why data is important to that organization and the risk that comes with data being lost from that organization. And ultimately the risk can be big fines.
It's massive.
Yeah.
I mean, some personal identifiable information comes out, that could be a GDPR fine straight away.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or it could be a leak to competitors. You've got a patented design, it goes to a competitor, that's your commercial advantage, not lost, but it's going to take a damage, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think that idea of we talk a lot, don't we, about kind of the impact of ransomware inside of organisations.
Yeah.
And the primary goal for most cyber criminals, and we talked about kind of malicious exfiltration of data, but the goal for most cyber criminals is financial gain. So they are looking for how can I gain financially from the piece of work that I'm looking to do? And taking your data, either making your data inaccessible or taking your data is a huge part of that. And actually, the examples you've given are just a similar kind of thing. Maybe not by people who would see themselves as cyber criminals, but if I'm, we a customer that we've worked with for a long time, they invested heavily in data loss prevention technology, in data governance and compliance technology.
Yeah.
And the whole driver for that was actually their HR team, who built in a process that when somebody was leaving that organization, they could pull up all information that user had accessed for the last 30 days. And then as part of the exit interview would say, oh, by the way, before you go, can we make sure we've got all of these files? Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Because we've seen you've copied those to a USB stick, which is in contravention of our policy. Oh, and by the way, you're leaving to join a competitor. So let's make sure you're not taking that information with you. And that justified the whole point of having data loss prevention technology for that organization.
Yeah, absolutely. You see, I think that organizations still don't appreciate the value of the data within their organization. Data ultimately is what differentiates you from your competitors. It's what defines you as a company. If we as an IT company, we've got information on our customers, we use that commercially, to target relevant solutions to advertise to. If we don't have access to that data, that has a real impact in finances of the company.
Yeah, it's, from operational to, as you say, from the fact that you might well get a visit from your local data protection regulator. These are all things that are not great. These are things that are not great in terms of your the way your customers see you, the way other businesses see you. Reputational damage of losing data are all huge. But you're absolutely right. I think organisations don't necessarily see the risk and the potential impact, which is why kind of if there was one thing that we would give as a takeaway from this, is that idea of buy-in. And I know you were on a call with me yesterday where we were talking with a customer who's kind of looking to go down this route, and I shared a story with them about one of the trickiest projects I've worked on in this kind of space. And it was, relatively big organization. We're looking to deploy a data loss prevention strategy. And I knew within 45 minutes of the first meeting that this was going to be almost impossible. And the reason it was going to be almost impossible, there was no business sponsorship for the idea of data loss prevention. It was an IT-driven project where they were going to look at changing the way people worked. They were looking at building classification into information. And without the sponsorship of an organization from top to bottom, that's going to be almost impossible. And as it turned out, it took them 6 months to find out this was going to be almost impossible.
Like a failure to launch on the project.
Yeah. And it was just that kind of delay. They ended up spending a lot of time and effort into failing to launch as well. So, that kind of piece around, understanding that across the business. So this is not just about your chief exec needs to understand. Your legal team needs to understand the impact of what does losing data mean to us from a legal point of view. What does it from a marketing point of view? What do marketing need to put in place to say if we lose data, how do we handle that? From a HR point of view, what's the impact of a user leaking data? How do you deal with that as an organization? There's lots of parts of a business that need to understand DLP. And I'm sure people might be watching this thinking, well, I thought you was going to talk about technology, how you can use Microsoft 365 or other vendors to build data loss prevention policies. And while you can do that, data loss prevention is much more about a strategy and approach than it will ever be about technology.
I absolutely, completely agree with that, because I think in the same way that we treat technology with cyber essentials, ultimately it is a business driver. We want to make the business more secure.
Yeah.
How do we do that? Well, we can use some technology to supplement that, but ultimately it is a people and process with technology. And DLP is exactly the same.
Yeah.
We've got all of these different intersections, and it's about making it work so that the business, doesn't lose data. I think for me, you mentioned your takeaway, get the business buy-in. I think, probably maybe a little bit of reflection on, the valuable nature of that data within your business. If that data was inaccessible, what would you do? If that data got out, what would you do? In some cases, some organizations are going to have to organize almost like a PR team, and treat it like a cyber incident response in the same way that, if it is a PII breach and their customer data is breached, they're going to have to contact all their customers, notify them of it before the ICO comes. And that may involve, kind of PR teams. You can't hire a PR team if you're in the middle of a disaster.
No.
So, you need to think about that before, in the same way that you can't test your business continuity plan in the middle of a disaster. So I'd say maybe kind of treat them the same. I think that's probably a good point to end on.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, if this has kind of captured people's attention around, well, why I would build a data loss prevention strategy. I mean, do let us know, leave something in the comments, and we can do an episode around some practical steps you can take in building data loss prevention strategy as well. But let us know if that's an episode that you think you want. But yeah, I think that's a great place for us to end.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. We're available everywhere you get your podcasts. Tune in next week.